Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're doing something a bit heavy, but honestly, absolutely crucial. We're taking an unflinching look at the complex realities of intimate and family violence. And yeah, it's a tough topic, but we really need to strip away those deeply ingrained societal myths and look at the actual sociological facts. That's how we're going to finally understand what's really going on. Let's jump right in with the question that kind of flips everything we assume about safety totally upside down. Ask yourself, right now, where is the most dangerous place you can be? I mean, naturally, we all picture, dark alleys, rough neighborhoods, or maybe crowded public spaces, right? Well, the data points to a pretty chilling reality. The answer is actually the home. This is what we call the paradox of intimacy. It turns out that our own homes and literally the people closest to us are statistically the most likely sources of physical and emotional harm. So intimacy doesn't always protect us. Tragically, it often actually increases our likelihood of experiencing abuse. To navigate this, here's our roadmap for today. 1. The paradox of intimacy. 2. Defining intimate violence. 3. Why does it happen? 4. The hidden victims. And 5. Responses and prevention. Okay, let's start with section 1, the paradox of intimacy, when closeness brings danger. 1 in 3. Just let that sink in for a second. It is a staggering, truly heartbreaking reality. More than 1 in 3 women, and actually nearly 1 in 4 men, have experienced sexual violence in their lives. And with almost 1 in 5 women experiencing completed or attempted rape, we're looking at an epidemic that cuts across literally all demographics. Now, obviously, the human suffering is unimaginable, but the economic fallout, it's massive too. Victims of severe intimate violence lose a cumulative 8 million days of paid leave every single year. The CDC estimates the annual cost exceeds $8 billion. $8 billion! That covers medical care, stolen property, lost wages. So the ripple effect of this touches absolutely every corner of our society. Moving on to section 2. Defining intimate violence, more than just an argument. To get a real handle on this, researchers Johnson and Ferraro categorize violence into distinct patterns, which is super helpful. First, you have situational couple violence. This is the kind that erupts in the heat of the moment during an argument. And crucially, it displays gender symmetry, meaning both men and women commit it at roughly equal rates. But contrast that with intimate terrorism. This isn't just an argument getting out of hand. It's a deliberate, systematic campaign where one partner actively tries to completely dominate and control the other. All right, section 3. Why does it happen? Sociological and psychological roots. So we have to ask the big question, why? Sociologists actually look at this through 5 primary models. First up is the individualistic model, which focuses on personal struggles, things like mental illness or substance abuse. Then the ecological model zooms way out, looking at cultures that actually approve of physical punishment. The feminist model highlights the underlying role of gender inequality and patriarchal structures. After that, we have the social stress and learning models. They basically view violence as a product of environmental pressures, like poverty, and say it's often learned from observing family behavior. And finally, the exchange social control model. This one suggests a pretty grim calculus. People weigh the rewards of violence against the potential costs, and they basically strike only when they think they can get away with it. Now, people often ask this incredibly fraught question. Well, why don't they just leave? The reality is a deeply complex web of barriers. We're talking economic dependence, religious pressure, the absolute primal need to protect their children, and literal fear for their lives if they even try to escape. But perhaps the most paralyzing factor of the whole shebang is learned helplessness. Prolonged battering actually conditions a victim to feel entirely powerless. It literally rewires the brain to make the mere act of leaving feel completely, utterly impossible. Which brings us to section 4, the hidden victims, beyond spousal abuse. When we look at the hundreds of thousands of children victimized every year, the breakdown is just, it's heartbreaking. Neglect accounts for nearly 75% of cases, so the sheer absence of basic care is actually the most prevalent form of harm. Tragically, this is followed by physical abuse and then horrific instances of sexual abuse. And the most devastating part of all this, the highest rate of this victimization happens to infants under the age of 1, literally our most defenseless population. Because this abuse mostly happens behind closed doors, intervention relies almost entirely on outsiders. Over 61% of reports come from professionals. We're talking teachers, law enforcement, medical staff who interact with the child. Less than 17% come from friends, family, or neighbors. That ironclad shield of family privacy often keeps this abuse completely hidden from the people living right next door. Expanding our scope a bit, we really need to talk about sibling violence. It is shockingly prevalent. Estimates suggest anywhere from 40 to 90% of kids experience it. Yet, despite being the single most common form of violence within a family, it generates the absolute least amount of societal concern. We kind of just write it off as kids being kids, completely ignoring the severe physical, psychological, and even sexual harm one sibling can inflict on another. Then, at the most extreme end of the spectrum, we see parricide, the murder of a parent by a child. And this isn't just random. It's a tragic, desperate endpoint that almost always stems from a slow, simmering escalation of household abuse, where verbal and emotional violence finally boils over into lethal physical violence. And finally, there's a largely hidden epidemic: elder abuse. In a staggering 90% of cases, the elderly victim is abused by their own family member. This ranges from physical neglect to financial manipulation, like, tricking them into signing over their life savings. Because the perpetrators are their own children or caretakers, researchers estimate that only 1 out of every 14 cases is ever even reported. Which leads us to our final section, Section 5, Responses and Prevention: How Society Intervenes. So, how do we handle this? Society essentially balances two main approaches. First, you've got controlling measures. This includes things like mandatory arrests and no-drop prosecutions, which basically force the legal system to act even if the victim wants to drop the charges. But research shows this can actually backfire, causing victims to underreport because they fear the financial or physical consequences of their partner being locked up. Countering that are compassionate measures. These focus on support and rehabilitation, like shelters or the Duluth model, which is a specific educational program aimed at helping abusers recognize their behavior and develop nonviolent critical thinking skills. There's no magic bullet here. True intervention usually requires a bit of both. Ultimately, meaningful prevention has to go much deeper than just calling the cops after the damage is already done. We have to break the family's cycle of violence altogether. That means doing the really hard work: addressing the cultural norms that secretly legitimize violence, reducing crushing societal stresses like poverty, and ending the social isolation that allows abusers to just hide in plain sight. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a really difficult question to chew on. Where do we draw the line between family privacy and public safety? We've seen that the whole cultural belief in a private family matter is a huge risk factor for violence, and that it often takes complete outsiders to save abused children. So to finally stop violence in the home, how much of our sacred family privacy must we be willing to sacrifice? It is a super heavy question for sure, but understanding the realities we covered today is absolutely the first step toward an answer. Thanks so much for joining me on this one.